This episode of Please Explain is sponsored by Aware Super, helping you get more from your future. From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Julia Carr-Katzel. It's Tuesday, July 11. For years now, fertility rates in Australia have been dropping. Access to cheap contraception, along with better education and career prospects, meant women started having babies a little later in life, and fewer of them. But now there are new reasons. Experts believe the most recent decline in the fertility rate is also a bellwether of unique contemporary challenges facing young workers. Today, senior economics writer Matt Wade on whether young people are being forced to choose between having homes and having children. Matt, you wrote a column last week with the provocative opening line, "Where have all the babies gone?" You're talking about a baby drought across the country. What's happening?
Well, Australia has got this really important measure. It's called the fertility rate. And basically what that does is it measures the number of children a woman can be expected to have over the course of her reproductive lifetime. Now, it's crucial because it determines the future of the population. But we've had a few events in the past few years that have really affected that rate. One is, of course, the COVID crisis, which saw the fertility rate fall to a absolute rock bottom. Never seen that rate before. It was at 1.59. Now that's way below the level that is so-called needed for the replacement of the population, not including migration, which is 2.1. We saw a bit of a recovery in 2021 after the worst sort of disruptions of COVID, but there's now signs that the cost of living crunch that's come with rising inflation, higher interest rates, is also now having a bit of a toll on the number of babies women in Australia are having. So this is playing out in all sorts of ways. It's most evident in our biggest cities. In Melbourne's city region, for example, which is the inner suburbs of Melbourne, the fertility rate has slumped to just 0.66 in 2021. Now that's a fraction of that replacement level rate of 2.1 that's needed to have a stable population, not including migration. And some interesting data has come out in Sydney since the last census, which was taken in 2021, to say that nearly half of all the women aged 30 to 34 have not had a child. Now, that's very high by comparison to previous years. So these are all signs that, if you like, that fertility rate, that's such a crucial measure for the future of the population, something's going on, things are changing.
And before we do get to the cost of living pressures and some of those contemporary challenges, you mentioned that fertility rates have been falling for a while. So I understand that fertility took a hit in the 1960s. What was happening then?
Well, the interesting thing was that before the 1960s, Australia's fertility rate reached an all-time high of around 3.5 babies per woman over the course of her reproductive life. Obviously, that's way above the replacement levels of 2.1. So the population was growing just by the new babies being born. That was during the so-called baby boom back after World War II. But something very significant happened in the early 1960s, the introduction of the contraceptive pill.
They come in big bottles for a year's supply, smaller bottles for a month's supply, and handy calendar packs that fit in a woman's purse.
And that led to a very big decline in the fertility rate because of the effects of that new technology.
How effective is it?
If taken as it should be, one pill every day for 3 weeks, it will stop ovulation.
What happens?
100%.
And that had a big effect. There was another impact again in the early 1970s when the contraceptive pill was put onto the pharmaceutical benefit scheme, which meant that it was much cheaper or more affordable for families to use that. And so those two things together led to a big decline in the Australian fertility rate. It then stabilised, though, for several decades, just below that replacement level of 2.1 that I mentioned before. However, we have seen in the past few years pretty much the last decade, signs that decline has begun again.
So those low fertility rates are pretty concerning. What's happening right now? What challenges are women facing right now?
I think what we're confronting at the moment is a combination of things. First of all, there is, if you like, a structural decline happening in the fertility rate being driven by changes in society. The fact that women now, on average, have higher levels of education than men. Women are wanting to make the most of that education, and so perhaps delaying childbirth or deciding not to have children altogether. We've also got, I guess, different social attitudes towards family, changing attitudes. That's all part of the story. And those things have always been there, you know, they're not new. But I think one thing that has really come into the picture, if you like, emerged onto the discussion in this area is this combination of contemporary challenges that young workers face. Experts have observed a really clear link between housing affordability and fertility rates. I mean, an example of that is you just have to look at our biggest cities. When you compare Sydney and Melbourne, which have relatively low fertility rates, to other capitals, you know, it is those cheaper to live in cities that have higher fertility rates. And so it seems pretty obvious that there's a connection between housing affordability and the formation of families, the well-being of families. You also have concerns about the security of work. Employment is a really important part of people's thinking about their childbearing decisions or family formation. And so the security of work is a big factor. And then I think we've even got issues like student debt, HECS debt, that was never part of the discussion, but now it's on the agenda in a way that perhaps is affecting people too. There's others. There's stagnant wages or even falling real wages like we have now because inflation is so high. There's one more thing that I think is really important in the current discussion about fertility and the future of families, and that is climate change. Young people are telling researchers that that's really a big factor in how they think about how many children they plan to have in their life. So all these new things, if you like, this combination of these contemporary challenges seems to be having an effect.
And that is really concerning. It sounds like, you know, young people these days are having to choose between having children and owning a home. But you also looked at some research, some studies that showed that women in particular were settling for fewer children than they would like, while some indicated that they don't want children at all. Can you tell us about those studies specifically and how this fits into this larger story?
One of the things to say about, you know, I guess decisions around family, they're very personal, okay? So people's circumstances vary hugely, their attitudes, their thinking about this. So one of the ways to think about it is choice. You know, ideally, people should be able to choose what's best for them, what they want. Many women cite the motherhood penalty for a reason why they are choosing not to have children or having fewer children, because that motherhood penalty is a lifetime financial cost to women who have a child. But there is some evidence that when the researchers survey people and ask how many children you would like to have in your life, it comes out in Australia at around 2 on average. And that's not unusual. Apparently most Western nations, researchers have found most developed nations, there's this ideal of 2 children. So there is a bit of evidence there that many women, or families I should say, many couples, may be settling for fewer children than they might otherwise have liked to have if circumstances were different. And so the question there is, are people able to make the choices that they want?
Hi, I'm Scott Hayward, and with me from Aware Super is Peter Hogg, Head of Advice Experiences and Enhancements. Peter, what are some of the simple yet important things people can do today to get more from their super?
Well, Scott, whether you're 25 or 55, it's worth spending a little time now to know where your hard-earned money is going. It's things like making sure all your super is in one fund. Chances are, if you have more than one fund, you're paying multiple sets of fees. Also, knowing how your super is invested, if it's right for your age, and asking that all-important question, is your fund performing well over the long term? Finally, make sure you take advantage of any help that your fund offers. Aware Super offers help and education via their website at no extra cost.
Thanks, Peter. Some small steps today can make a big difference to your retirement. With super advice and super returns, Aware Super is super helpful. For more information about Aware Super, including their PDS and CMD, visit aware.com.au.
Okay, and this is also a part of a larger global trend, I understand. Can you tell me about some other countries and what they're facing?
Well, it's interesting, the global fertility rate, because, we have a rate for Australia, but of course we also can calculate this figure on a global level. It is falling. Some people do still have this perception that, the population of the world is out of control and it's rising too fast and, it's going to be bad and there'll be crisis as a result of that. There were concerns about that several decades ago, but the fact is now that the global fertility rate is actually falling quite rapidly. It's very acute in some countries. One nation often singled out is Japan, which has seen a precipitous fall in its fertility rate. The median age in Japan, that is the middle age of all people in the country, is approaching 50. So that means half the population is aged over 50. We've got other countries where the fertility rate fall has been very significant. South Korea is often mentioned. Their fertility rate is down to 0.78. And as I said, the replacement level is 2.1. So you can see that's kind of a fraction of what you need for the population to be replaced without migration. Parts of Southern Europe have also been affected by lower fertility rates. Italy's often used it as an example there, but they're certainly not alone. And as I say, even in some big developing countries like Brazil, the fertility rate has fallen quite dramatically. So this is part of a global trend. And obviously that there's a lot of parts of that are great, because what it tells you is that, people, especially women, are being able to make choices about what they do in this sort of area. But by the same token, this does have significant economic implications.
So let's talk about those. So why does this matter? Is there a reason that people should care that people are having less children, that there's a quote, baby drought?
Yeah. Well, look, obviously there's a lot of debate about this. People have all sorts of opinions, but the reality is that our population is ageing. And that means that over time, there's a much bigger group of people who are elderly or retired, who are no longer working, who need to be supported by younger workers who are paying taxes. And that balance, if you like, is shifting. And that means that it will be harder for governments in future to raise the taxes to pay for things like pensions and especially healthcare that older people will inevitably demand. So that's a big issue. It's not as though we haven't been aware of this. The federal government and indeed some state governments put out regular reports called the Intergeneration Report, which look at the effects of the ageing of the population on the budget, basically, and how things are going to be able to be afforded in future. And that's a really healthy debate. I think Australia's been quite good in raising the issue and thinking about the effects of the ageing of the population. It's interesting, though, that the most recent Intergeneration Report really downgraded Australia's fertility rate. In 2015, that report predicted Australia would have a long-term fertility rate of 1.9, but just 5 years later, they slashed that to 1.62. So what that tells you is that there's an awareness of the decline in fertility rates, but it's nevertheless still going to be a challenge for governments as they prepare for a very different population kind of makeup, if you like. The other point that it's worth making here from an economic point of view, it was pointed out in a recent special report by The Economist magazine, and that is that older populations tend to be much more risk averse, less entrepreneurial, and they're kind of less innovative, because they make the point that if you look at the people who lodge a patent, this is for a new technology or a new way of doing business or whatever, they tend to be lodged by young people. That's the group who comes up with new ideas to make our economy run differently and more efficiently. So if you have a society that is not as comfortable with change, less innovative, coming up with fewer new ideas, that has an effect on productivity. And that's really one of the biggest drivers of our standard of living is our productivity growth. And so an older population might have to come to terms with a society which is not coming up with that innovation that we kind of have been used to and have benefited from so much in the past sort of 100 years.
Okay, so you spoke about the governments producing these reports and the challenges they face. What are some of the solutions, or what should they be doing?
Well, I think it's interesting that it has been a pretty difficult policy nut to crack. There's a lot of countries in the world that are grappling with this, as I said, and in some places they're just trying cash handouts, so families are getting money if they have more babies. But in some of those countries, the fertility rate isn't really responding. So some of those policies are available to people, but they're not taking it. So I think it kind of raises some really big policy challenges. You know, what is it that's stopping people from having more children? And I mean, I guess there's a lot of reasons for that too. If you bring it back to Australia, in my opinion, having kind of done research in this area and reported on it quite a bit, I think, going back to the point we were raising before, that for all sorts of reasons, there are big obstacles confronting young workers. Housing's very expensive. The cost of raising children, especially childcare, is an impediment. Stagnant wages is a big issue, in my opinion. So if we could get around those things, if we could deal with them in a better way than we are now, we might get some response. If I had to identify 2 policy areas where we need to really improve, and will definitely have to take shape in future, is paid parental leave. Australia has a paid parental leave scheme, but it's not very generous by the standards of our other developed countries. We could really make that much more generous and longer. So parents, both men and women, can have more time to care for small children. The other one is the childcare system, which, look, again, the federal government has put some more money into that this year, but you know, the system is not really fit for purpose, and I think it's going to have to undergo a much more significant change to serve the needs of young families. Another point I'd make here is this issue is too often, in my opinion, framed about as a women's issue. It's an issue for parents, for both men and women, and I think the more we think about it like that and think about how we support fathers as well as mothers is a really important way of conceiving of the challenge.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Matt.
Thank you.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Hannah Mills-Turbot. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Julia Karkatzel. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening. This episode of Please Explain was brought to you by Aware Super. With super advice and super returns, Aware Super is super helpful. For more information about Aware Super, including their PDS and TMD, visit aware.com.au.